Okay, so today we're going to continue the operant conditioning assignment by discussing the schedules of reinforcement. So I'm going to go through and put this thing on the board that follows what I'm doing. I'm starting on slide 18. Okay, so when we're dealing with giving reinforcement, these are the schedules of reinforcement. And as we deal with that, we have talked so far as if every response gets a consequence. So remember, operant conditioning is stimulus to response to consequence. And one way to reinforce our learner is to reinforce them every single time they make a response. So far, that's how we've been discussing it, right? So that kind of schedule is called a continuous schedule of reinforcement. A continuous schedule. In a continuous schedule, every response gets a consequence. In other words, every response gets a reward. But there's another way to do this as well. And that way is called a partial schedule. In a partial schedule of reinforcement, only some responses get a consequence. So I don't reinforce you every single time that you do something, but only sometimes. And in the real world, that's kind of how things work, right? You don't always get rewarded every single time you hold the door open for somebody. That person doesn't say thank you, right? Sometimes people will not say thank you. So sometimes our behavior is rewarded and sometimes it's not. Okay. So as we're looking at partial schedules of reinforcement, there are two types that we can talk about. The first one is called a ratio schedule. Ratio means the number of responses made. Ratio means number. So here, we're going to reinforce our learner based on the number of responses that they make, okay? So let's say I decide that I'm going to give my rat a pellet every 5 times they press the bar, not every single time. You with me? Okay. So another example, where I'm 20 now, is another type of schedule that's partial. So this is ratio, and then we're going to put B over here. We're going to have interval schedules. So an interval partial schedule. Interval means period of time, right? All right, so we're going to talk about a period of time in which the learner has to make at least one response to get a consequence. Okay? So I might say, okay, I'm going to give my rat a pellet if they press the bar once within a minute's time, or 3 minutes time, or whatever I choose. Okay? So that's not too hard to understand, but it gets a little bit more complicated because within ratio and within interval, we can either choose to use a fixed ratio or a variable ratio, or a fixed interval, or a variable interval, okay? So a fixed schedule, a fixed ratio. Now fixed means it always stays the same, okay? The same. And if it's a ratio, it means the number of responses. So here, I'm going to give my learner a consequence or a reward for a certain number of responses, and that number is always going to stay the same. You understand? Okay, so I'm gonna give a consequence based on the number of responses, sorry. And that number is going to stay the same. In a fixed interval, it's fixed, so it always stays the same. And it's an interval, so it's based on a period of time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give my learner a consequence based on their making one response within a period of time and that period of time is going to stay the same because it's fixed. So I might give my learner a consequence, a reward for pressing the bar once in 3 minutes, and it's always going to stay at 3 minutes, at 3 minutes, at 3 minutes. We can also go to a variable schedule. So I'm still on slide 20. In a variable schedule, so here's a variable which means it changes or varies. Ratio, which means it's a period of a number of responses, excuse me. So I'm going to give my learner a consequence based on the number of responses, because that's what makes it ratio. And that number is going to change, to vary. Okay? So it's a changing number. So sometimes it might be after one response, sometimes after 3, sometimes after 5, sometimes after 2. It keeps changing. And maybe in the average at the end of the day is every 5 responses or every 3 responses, but it changes every time. And in a variable ratio, variable means it varies. I'm sorry, variable interval is what we're doing now, I apologize. In a variable interval, variable means it changes, interval means it's a period of time. So here I'm going to give the learner a consequence based on they're making at least one response within a period of time, but that's going to be a varying or changing period of time. Okay? So I'm going to give you some examples of this that will make it much easier for you to understand. So I'm moving the whole damn thing over here. We're moving to this side. All right. So now, there we go. You're gonna be on YouTube if you keep sticking your head out there. Okay. So now we're going to go to the examples of each of these. okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put a double line here, and above the double line, I'm gonna put the two ratio schedules. And below the double line, I'm gonna put the two interval schedules. So we have fixed ratio and variable ratio, fixed interval and variable interval. Okay? So we start with the fixed ratio. In a fixed ratio, ratio means we're gonna reward the learner based on the number of responses. And it's always gonna stay the same. So it'll be the same number. So if I pick, let's say I pick 3, okay? Then my learner would make 1, 2, 3 responses. And after 3 responses, I would give my learner a consequence or reward. 1, 2, 3 responses, and I give a reward, a consequence. Okay, 1, 2, 3 responses, and I give my learner the consequence. So it constantly stays that way. You with me? All right, so let's say I give you a bonus for every 3 health club memberships you sell. Do you get anything after selling 1? No, right? You have to sell 3 to get anything. Does it matter how long you take to sell 3? Talk to me.
No.
No, it doesn't. If you sell them all today, that's when you get your $100 bonus. If it takes you 3 years, then that's when you get your $100 bonus. You with me? Okay. So it always stays the same. Now the fixed ratio, this tells you a little bit about it. The fixed ratio tends to make the learner have a high response rate because the learner feels in control of their reinforcements. They know that if they work harder, they'll get more reinforcement. And the reinforcement is based on a ratio, a number of responses. In other words, it's based on the learner's performance. You got it? Yes? Talk to me. You with me?
Bueno.
All right, that's the easiest one. Variable ratio means it's a changing or varying, I don't know how to spell varying, ratio, which means number of responses. So let's say I decide I'm gonna, on average, I'm gonna reinforce my learner every 5 responses. Okay, every 5 responses. So sometimes after 3, the learner might get a consequence. Sometimes 1 and the learner gets a consequence. Sometimes the learner has to make 8 responses before they get a consequence. Then maybe 4 and they get a consequence, and 1 and they get a consequence. They just never know. Okay? But in the end of the day, the average will be 5 every 5 times. So it's different. If I tell you it's every 5 times up here, that'd be ratio. If I tell you it's on average, that'd be a fixed ratio. If I tell you on average it's every 5 times, that's a variable ratio because it changes, but the average at the end of the day is 5. So when we look at a variable ratio, the reinforcement is going to be based on the number of responses, but that number of responses that are needed to get a consequence or reinforcer or reward will change with every trial. So an example would be gambling on a slot machine, right? So you never know which quarter, let's say, that you're putting in there is going to win. So you win more for making more responses. In other words, the more quarters you put in there, the more you'll win. But you never know which quarter is going to be the one that wins. So that's why it's so hard to walk away from that machine, because you think, I put in all these quarters, and what if the very next person comes along and puts in a quarter and they win? What after all the quarters I put in, right? So you understand, you just never know. Now variable ratio is has the highest response rate of all the different schedules. The learner will work the hardest with variable ratio. They know the harder they work, the more reinforcement they're going to get, and they know that the reinforcement is based on their performance. They just don't know which responses will be rewarded and which will not. So this happens a lot in real life. Like I told you, you might open the door for 3 people before the third person says thank you. And then the very next person says thank you. And then you're sitting there opening the door, holding the door open for 7 people, and only when the 8th one comes along does that person care to thank you. You see what I mean? So this is how often things happen in real life. Okay. So the next one we're going to talk about is fixed interval. So now we're talking about periods of time. I'm going to draw these brackets, and each bracket is going to represent a period of time. I'm going to draw, in this case, I'm trying to draw them all the same length, okay? So I'm doing my best here. All right. So let's say they're all this long. Okay, so each of these is a bracket, and it represents a period of time. The period of time can be a minute, it can be an hour, a day, a week, a month. It could be 3 minutes, or 3 days, or 3 weeks, whatever I want, right? And the learner only has certain opportunities to get a consequence. That would be here. At the end of the time period, every time a time period ends, that's an opportunity for the learner to get a consequence. So the learner has to make one response within this time period in order to get the consequence. Okay? Just one response, and the learner gets a consequence. What happens if the learner works their butt off? How many responses do they get? Excuse me, how many consequences do they get? Just one. And does it come any faster? No. So the only way to not get a consequence during this time period is to not work at all. So you make one response, you're going to get a consequence. So, for example, I get paid on a yearly salary, okay, that they split up into every 2 weeks. And so if I work my butt off that year or that 2-week period or whatever, let's say the 2-week period, I get the same amount as if I come in here and pop a film in and watch Facebook, okay? So either way, right, I just minimal work will get you what you want. So busting your butt is only out of your own desire to work better or do a better job, because you don't get paid anymore for working harder, okay, or even for doing a better job. If y'all get paid by the hour, or you get paid every couple of weeks or something like that, or every week, this is how they're paying you. And interestingly, this has the very lowest level of responses. So this is how almost everyone in America is paid. Whether you get paid annually, or you get paid by the hour or something like that, or you get paid weekly. And yet this is the lowest rate of any schedule as far as how hard will the person work. So the person realizes, if I work really hard, I'm not going to get anything more, so why should I work hard? The reinforcement doesn't come any faster. If I make this response right away, right when my period starts, I get all my work done, does it matter? No, I still have to wait till the end of the period to get my reinforcement. So the reinforcement doesn't increase when the learner works harder. It doesn't come faster or sooner when the learner works faster. So why bother? Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is a variable interval. And in a variable interval, you have periods of time, but those periods of time keep changing. So now I'm going to draw some brackets, and the brackets are going to represent periods of time, and obviously I'm trying to make them different sizes now, right? Different lengths. All right, so it could be that it starts like that, and then like this, and then like this, and then like that, and then this, and then this, and so forth, okay? So it's changing periods of time. Now the learner has an opportunity to get a reinforcement only when this time period ends. The thing is that the learner doesn't know when the time period is going to end, okay? Just like in variable ratio where the learner didn't know how many responses am I going to have to do before I get a consequence. Here you don't know how long you have to wait. So you make a response and you wait for the consequence, and you tend to make another response right away. Even rats will learn. As soon as I get a consequence, I need to make a response so that the the teacher knows I want another consequence. So when the consequence comes, the reward comes, I make a response immediately so that I don't miss this opportunity. Okay? So if I make one here and I wait and I get one, and I make another one and I get a consequence, if I don't hurry and make a response here, I will lose this opportunity, right? So if I wait until like time's going that way, if I wait this long, I just missed that one. And so now I'll get this one, but I missed one. Okay? So in other words, the rat in the Skinner box presses the lever and waits. Sometimes it has to wait a really long time, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a very short period of time before it gets another consequence. But the second it gets a consequence, it presses the lever again to let the teacher know, I'm ready for another one. Okay, I'm ready for another pellet of food or whatever. Now, this one is hard to understand in real life, but I've got the perfect example because that's how cool I am. So I'm going to show you the perfect example of this. I'm going to erase this, okay? Part of it anyway. All right. You're in a building, and this building has many, many floors. And it has 2 elevators. Okay? So you've got 2 elevators. 2 elevators. You've got a button. Stimulus is the button. Response is you press it. Consequence is the arrival of the elevator. So you want an elevator, and that's how you're going to get it. Okay? Now let's say this one fills up with people, you don't fit, or they're all too stinky, and it takes off. When do you press this button to get another elevator? The second this one takes off, right? Yeah. So you press it to let the teacher know, I need another one. This is why the minute we get a consequence, we press it again immediately. Okay? Now sometimes the elevator might be up here, and it's going to take a really long time to get to you. Other times it might be sitting right there, and it might open immediately, right? So sometimes it's immediate reward, and sometimes you have to wait a long time for it to get there. But you do know that if you sit around and don't press that button, the elevator could have been here, and it could have gotten to you right away, but now it didn't come because you didn't press the button right away, and it went to pick up people here, and then it's going to come back to you. Are you with me? Does everybody understand? So I love to teach you stuff you already know, and you already know this, right? You already know this. You know that if you don't press the button right away, you might miss an elevator, right? Because it might be right there, and it might go get people, and it takes a lot longer to get to you simply because you didn't press the button right away. So the minute that one of these consequences leaves or is over, one arrival of the elevator, you press the button again to try to get another consequence, another arrival of the elevator. You got it? So it's a variable ratio, interval. It's based on a period of time. You only have to make one response. Does it help to press that button over and over? Huh? No, pressing it over and over doesn't make the elevator come any faster. So why work your butt off? If this is a long period and you're sitting here waiting for this elevator, why press the button all these times? To relieve your frustration, maybe, but you know it's not going to make the elevator come faster, right?
Why do we do that, though?
Why do we do that? Because we're frustrated. And so we're just like, what, you didn't hear me? Come on, man. Right. But basically, that's what it's about. Okay, so the next slide is about how to figure out Sorry, we gotta go over this one. So we already did, but the learner knows that working harder will not lead to more reinforcement, so why work hard? The reinforcement doesn't come any faster when the learner works faster. It doesn't increase when the learner works harder. Why press the elevator button more than once when you know that response will not get you the elevator any faster? It won't get your consequence any faster. But you do learn, even rats learn, to make the response right after receiving a consequence, to let the teacher know I'm ready for another reinforcer, okay? Another consequence. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to figure out which one of these is best and which one is worse. Now, I already told you that variable ratio is best, but let me show you how you can figure this out. Okay, so we're going to go 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is going to be the best 1, and 4 is going to be the worst. Best at what, people?
To not let the response extinct.
Who's talking? Oh, there you are. I cannot see you. I'm like, some of these, what?
I think you mean that the best type of reinforcement that doesn't let the response extinct, right? Extinction.
I'm saying, no, not really. I'm saying which one is going to give you what?
The best.
The most responsive.
The most responses. Who said that? There you go, big guy. Okay, the highest number of responses. So this is how you get the most work out of your learner. And the worst is this is the lowest number of responses from your learner. Okay, so the first two are ratio. So the first question you ask yourself, is it a ratio scale or an interval? Because ratio schedules are always better than interval scales. They get more responses, okay? So the first two types will be ratio, and obviously the second two will be interval. The second question you ask yourself, is it fixed or variable? Because within each type, variable is better than fixed. What does that mean? Within each type. When we're looking at ratio, variable is better than fixed. When we're looking at interval, variable is better than fixed. So the lowest response rate comes from being on some sort of salary or hourly or weekly pay. In other words, you get paid based on making minimal performance within a period of time, fixed interval. And the best is variable ratio, which you have a changing number of responses to get your consequence. And we talked about an example was gambling. Let me give you another example because I forgot to give you this example. Another example is real estate. So in real estate, I don't know how much y'all know about that, but in real estate, what happens is that you get paid usually some sort of commission, which is a percentage of the sale of the house, okay? Most people don't buy a house without showing it, right? Without seeing it, excuse me. So realtors have to show houses. They know if I don't show it, I'm not going to sell it. So what they do is they work really hard and try to show you as many houses as possible. And you don't know if I show you a house, the first house I show you, you're like, that's it, I want that one. Or they may have to show house after house after house before the person decides on one, right? So you just never know which one is going to be the next house, which house is going to sell. So you never, will it be the very next one? I don't know. Just like will the next quarter be the winner on the gambling? I don't know. So you keep trying. You got it? Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. So with this, you really have to believe me, okay? I don't know if you're not believing me so far, but if you're doubting me, now's the time to believe me. I'm going to give you some definitions, and it is imperative that you go by my definitions, okay? So let me go get some different color Crayolas here. I'm going to use red and blue. I'm going to use some green. I guess we could do purple and this color. Okay. Okay. So, let's look at our formula. Stimulus to response to consequence. And I already told you last time that there are two types of consequence, reinforcement and punishment. So we're going to use, we're going to use green for reinforcement. And we're going to use red for punishment. So the definition of reinforcement is a consequence that leads to an increase in responses in the future. We already saw that. And the definition of punishment is any consequence that leads to a decrease in responses in the future. So that you already know. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about positive and negative. So we're going to use two other colors. Let's say we'll have this light blue will be positive, and we're going to talk about positive reinforcement. Sorry, let me use another one. And we'll talk about positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. Wow, I need more hands. An octopus would be really great right now. So we have positive reinforcement and negative and positive punishment. What is the definition of positive? Here, the definition of positive is mathematical. You add something. That's what positive means. So positive, the positive part just means that you add something. Okay? Positive punishment, positive reinforcement, positive punishment. In both, you add something. The other definition is negative. Negative means also, as in math, that you take something away. So you remove or take away. S/T means something. All right, so whether we're talking about negative reinforcement or negative punishment, the negative part just means you're taking something away. So I can't explain to you how important it is to your life for you to take these definitions, okay, that I'm giving you and use them. Really, I just can't even explain, okay? Negative means minus, and positive means plus, okay? All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to make a chart, because, you know, I'm a chart-happy guy. And I'm going to put reinforcement here. And punishment here. All right. So in other words, here and here I'm going to talk about punishment. And here I'm going to talk about reinforcement. All right. And then here I'm going to put positive So positive reinforcement and positive punishment. And here I'm going to use negative reinforcement and negative punishment. So negative is here. So the definition of negative is that you remove something or take something away or subtract it as /t, something. And the definition of positive is that you add, give something. Jeez. Okay, that's a hard day today. All right, so those are our quadrants where we're going to talk about each of these four things. We're going to start, like I said, positive means add, negative means take away. All right, positive reinforcement. Let's talk about that. Okay. The positive part means I'm going to give something. That's why it's in the color that represents positive. And it's going to lead to an increase in responses in the future. That's the positive part. You with me? Yeah? Everybody with me? Yeah. Okay. So examples of positive reinforcement. First of all, if I give you something and it's reinforcement, that means you're going to do it again, right? Would I give you a good thing or a bad thing? I give you something good. Okay, so I give you something good, something you like, something that is desirable. Okay, so an example would be I give you praise, I give you attention, I give you a gift. Okay, some sort of reward. Money's nice, right? You with me? All right, so that's positive reinforcement. Now, we're going to talk about negative reinforcement. So negative means I'm going to take away something. So I'm going to remove something. And the outcome is going to be reinforcement. So what's it going to do to the behavior? It's not going to positive. We're talking about negative reinforcement. What's going to happen to the response in the future? Is it going to go up or down?
It's going to go up.
Negative reinforcement.
Go down.
It's going to what?
Go down.
I give up. I'll be jumping out the window now.
It will go up, sure. It will increase.
Reinforcement is an increase in behavior. What did I tell you about believing me? We're not there yet. You're not believing me, okay? I don't know what it's going to take for you to trust me, but if you don't trust me on this, you're going down, okay? Positive means add, negative means take away or remove. Reinforcement means it increases a response. Punishment means it decreases it.
On negative reinforcement, at the top could take away something.
Yeah.
Negative reinforcement, yeah, you take away something. Negative means you take it away. Reinforcement means it makes it go away. So would I take away a good thing or a bad thing?
It will be a bad thing.
A bad thing. Okay, sorry, it should be black.
I saw an example of this. For example, I don't know if it's a negative reinforcement. So your mom tells you to go clean your room and you do it because you don't want her to nag about it. So that's a negative reinforcement.
Yeah, okay, so take away something bad. Okay. You're going to see so many examples of this you wish you never had, because there's
It's
a quiz on this that's very long. And it's not just a quiz, there's some practice also. Okay, so you remove something bad Okay, so here's some examples. What can I remove that's bad? So if I take this away, you'll do it again. I guess I could click, huh? Really? All right. So I can lift a restriction. You can go out to play after you do your homework. It'll make you do your homework more so you can get out to play. Okay? Medicines that relieve pain or discomfort. Okay, so before I even get to that one, because I'm afraid, I want to remind you that, well, I want to ask you, what do positive and negative reinforcement have in common?
They both increase the probability of response.
They both increase the response in the future. You with me? Y'all are all sitting there like you with me, but you ain't with me when the test comes. Look at me, okay? Look at me. I'm going to keep saying look at me until everybody's looking at me. All right, so what do positive and negative reinforcement, you're not looking at me, have in common?
Increase the
Increase the
response.
response.
They increase the response. You with me?
Yes.
Everybody gets that? Okay, so if it's reinforcement, the response goes up, whether it's positive or negative, okay? So let me give you the examples of this. You have a headache, and you take a Tylenol, and the Tylenol removes your headache. What are you going to do the next time that you have a headache?
Take a
Chug
Tylenol.
some
Take Tylenol. So Tylenol removing your headache teaches you to use Tylenol. It increases your behavior in the future. You have heartburn, you take Tums. Your heartburn goes away. Next time you have heartburn, you're more likely to use Tums than you were even before, right? Okay. So all of those are examples of negative reinforcement. The next thing we're going to talk about is positive punishment. So here we go again with one that people have trouble with. Positive means you give something, and the result is punishment, which means it leads to a decrease in responses in the future. This is positive. Does positive mean pleasant? Huh?
No.
Does positive mean desirable?
No.
Does positive mean nice?
Mm.
No, it means you added something. So are you going to add a good thing or a bad thing?
Good. Add a good.
If you want the response to go down, what do you got to do?
Add a good thing.
Bless you, my Lord. Huh?
You're adding a good thing.
You going to give something what?
Good.
If you give something good, if you got a good thing, would you do it again?
It depends. Like, if you get pulled over, then he let you off on a warning.
You going to speed again?
Less likely to.
You're less likely to.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're less likely to, that wasn't reinforcement.
Yes.
Okay,
Suppose.
you give something good or bad?
Bad.
You give up. Bad. People, are you with me? Okay, I feel like I'm pulling teeth, man. Give something bad to decrease that response in the future. Okay, examples. Look, you could look at the board. There's all the answers. Okay, examples. I impose a fine. I give you a spanking. Those are all examples. I gave you something bad, so you won't do that again. Okay? So, in positive punishment, I add something bad. Whew. Lord have mercy. Are you with me? All right. Negative punishment. I'm going to take something away. That's the negative part. So I'm going to take away something. Almost forgot that. And it's gonna lead to a decrease in responses in the future. Fix that. Did I take away a good thing or a bad thing?
A good thing. You took away something good.
The what?
Good thing.
You take away a good thing. Jeez, thank you, God. Okay, so examples. Imprisonment is an example. If I put you in prison, I've taken away a good thing.
Freedom.
What's good for prison?
I need to hit the next button. Slide 42. Okay, so I can ground a child, right? I can take away something. You can't go outside, or you can't play with your phone, or something, right? So I take away something good because I don't like what they did and I don't want them to do it again. Well, the good news is there's a lot of practice opportunities for you, which apparently you need. Anybody see the top to my marker? Here it is. Okay? Woo, people, woo. I'm sweating. Y'all making me sweat. It's not supposed to sweat when you teach. Okay. How are we doing on these two concepts? Schedules of reinforcement, positive and negative reinforcement. You good?
Yeah.
All right. So let's summarize operant conditioning. Slide 43. The responses that we learn in operant conditioning are external, voluntary, and goal-oriented. Right? The exact opposite of classical, where they internal and involuntary. A brand new response is learned. A brand new response. Not like in classical, where you learn to make a response that you already knew how to do to a new stimulus. Here you're learning a response you were not born knowing how to do. The association that's made here is between a response and its consequence. Whereas in classical, the association was between two stimuli. And the learner is active and focused on the consequence. Whereas in classical, they were passive and focused on the unconditioned stimulus. And this is all based on Thorndike's law of effect that says that the consequences we receive will predict what responses we make in the future. You got it? All right, now I want to talk to you a little bit about the different applications of classical and operant conditioning. I need to get a camera. I need to get one of those cameras on rollers so it goes smoothly. All right, the first of these is a token economy. In a token economy, you use some sort of secondary reinforcer. And you give this secondary reinforcement for good behavior. That's not my thing. That's why that's happening. I have to bring my own. I have to buy my own erasers because they suck so bad. Okay, so you give a secondary reinforcer. It can be a token, a chip. It can be a point on the board, a sticker on a piece of paper, whatever. You give this secondary reinforcer, and the person is later able to trade it in for something that they like or something that's more reinforcing. So for the best example of this is money, of course. In our society, money is useless unless we can trade it in. But a good example would be what we call these token economies that are they're given like to children, and the children earn points for good behavior, or they earn chips, or they earn stickers, or whatever, and then they can trade those in for something they like free time on the computer or something like that. Obviously, this is based on operant conditioning, because the behavior is voluntary and because there's a consequence, right? Right? Right, okay. Timeout, I'm sure all of you have heard about timeout. Timeout, the real name is timeout from positive reinforcement. So you have to already be giving reinforcement, and then you remove the person from that reinforcement when they misbehave. So if you're already paying attention to your child, or you're already playing a game with your child, you can stop playing that game or stop giving them attention to see if they'll stop doing whatever they're doing that you don't like. This is often misused because people will try to put their kid in timeout when they weren't giving them positive reinforcement, so you weren't paying any attention to your child, and now all of a sudden you say, okay, that's it, that was bad, get in timeout. Well, that's punishment, that's not a timeout from reinforcement, okay? That's not removing a good thing, okay? So anyway, this is obviously based on operant conditioning, and a couple of things that are related to classical. One of them is flooding, which is also called exposure, and exposure is a way of treating fears. And when the person is afraid of something, you flood them with it or expose them to it over and over until they no longer have that fear response. So that's based on classical because fears are involuntary, and because it's the pairing of the fearful situation with a situation when nothing bad happened. Like if they're afraid of elevators, you put them in the elevator and you stop the elevator, just wherever, and you don't let them get out for a while. When you do that, they realize, hey, I didn't die. So it's the combination of that, those two things, yeah.
But it doesn't always work, right?
It usually works. Sometimes it doesn't, but usually it will.
So for like cases where it wouldn't work, what would be like, I don't know, why wouldn't it work for those cases?
Like I said, in most cases it does.
Like with PTSD, I guess, with people who have like, I don't know.
Sometimes the reaction is so strong. Okay, so let me explain it this way. If I'm having this, let's say you put this buy key in front of me and I'm afraid of it. And I'm kind of like, oh, okay, all right. And then you like throw it all over me and bathe me in a bunch of bottles and stuff. And I might be, okay, I'm all right. I didn't die. But if my fear of this is so great that I'm losing my mind about it, right, then I'm not going to calm down enough. And my fear is getting once again paired with this because I'm so overreacting to it. So the level of reaction, that's why in PTSD, they do exposure, but they don't do it quite as completely as with flooding. They do it more gradually. And sometimes what they use is this next thing called systematic desensitization. So systematic desensitization is also used to remove fears, therefore it's classical conditioning. And what it is a slower process. It works just as well as flooding, but flooding actually tends to work faster. So in this, what you do is you ask the person, what are you afraid of? And then you have them make a hierarchy of what they're most afraid of to what they're least afraid of. So like if they're afraid of cats, seeing a drawing of a kitten might be the least fearful thing, all the way up to having to pet a cat, okay? All right, or hold a cat. So then you teach them how to relax. So you teach them all these techniques to keep themselves calm. And at first you go through this hierarchy of situations with a cat, exposure to a cat, little by little, in their mind, which is called covert desensitization. So in your mind, you're dealing with the picture of the little cat, and then you're dealing with something more and more and more, and then finally, you're dealing with holding a cat. And then after you've gone through that over and over in your head, and you're staying relatively relaxed because you're pairing the relaxation I taught you with these steps, then you do it in real life, which is called in vivo desensitization.
I have a question.
Okay.
Here in
reinforcement schedule that works best to keep an existing behavior is a fixed, a variable ratio, right?
Yeah, variable
And
ratio is best to continue
something that,
a response. But the best way to learn, which I'm glad you asked me, the best way to learn a response is with a continuous schedule. Every response gets a consequence when you're learning the behavior
so
and
it will
the
be a fixed
response.
ratio?
Huh?
So that will be a fixed ratio?
It is a fixed ratio, but call it continuous. Call it continuous. So it's a fixed ratio, but it's 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. So a continuous schedule is best to learn a response in the first place, and a variable ratio is best for keeping that response at a high rate. Okay, any questions about classical or operant? We're moving on to something different. Okay,
The adverse effects of punishment.
what?
Adverse effects of punishment.
Remember we talked about how there's a whole slide that says that I'll show you what slide it is. Right here. It motivates the learner to avoid punishment. The question, what are the adverse effects of punishment? It motivates you mostly to avoid punishment. It doesn't eliminate the behavior, only suppresses it. You don't unlearn the response. No alternative is learned. It can make people stop trying, and it also can make people aggressive and angry. Okay, so now we're going to talk about cognitive learning. Is that all the questions? Okay, so cognitive learning is a type of learning where your thinking is involved for sure. And the main thing about it is that it deals with two things that classical and operant did not deal with, okay? So there's two things up here. One of them is called latent learning. And Tolman came up with the idea that sometimes people don't show that they know something. And animals too. Because they might not be motivated to show it at the moment. And he said you can't assume people don't know something, or animals, because they don't show it. So for example, if the rat goes into the Skinner box and it's not hungry, it may not press the bar, right? And in operant conditioning, that would make us think the rat doesn't know how to press the bar. But in this case, Tolman is reminding us that you have to be motivated to show your behavior, that you can keep your learning hidden. Latent means underlying or hidden, okay? And we'll talk about an example of this here in a moment. So the next concept is Albert Bandura. Bandura is, I would say, and most people probably would agree, that he is the most widely known and recognized and probably the highest achieving psychologist alive today. He's over at Stanford. And Bandura realized that according to, let's talk about operant conditioning. According to traditional operant conditioning, you only learn from things that happen to you, right? Okay? But there are times when you can learn things from other people, right? For example, you can see somebody get a ticket at this one light. Every time you go by, there's a cop there, and you've seen 3 people get a ticket there. Maybe even if you've only seen one, it makes you slow down. You didn't get punished, but yet you're acting like you did, and you didn't. All you did was learn from someone else. And this can happen for classical and operant. So cognitive learning is the combination of both of these things. The fact that we can hide our learning if we're not motivated to show it, and observational learning, the fact that we learn from other people. So observational learning is really important. And we can talk about how it applies to both classical and operant. So for example, you can learn to be afraid of something, which is classical, right? Because it's involuntary, by observing other people being afraid or unafraid. You can unlearn it too. So if you see somebody, like I knew a kid who was starting to act like she was afraid of bridges because her mom was afraid of bridges. Well, her mom was from LA, so she obviously was afraid of bridges because of earthquakes. But this kid lived in Texas. She's got no business being afraid of earthquakes, right? So this is just her watching her mom be afraid. You can also become afraid of a dog if you watch somebody else get mauled by it, right? It can be traumatic to you, even if it didn't happen to you, to just see it. All right, and then there's operant conditioning, where we learn from other people getting rewarded and punished. So when we see other drivers getting a ticket, we slow down, even though we didn't get the ticket. Anytime you learn something from, like for example, dances, unless you're into making your own dance moves, if you learn like a line dance or something, you learn from watching other people, right? That's how you learn, from watching other people. That looks fun to them. They're the ones having fun, not you. And so then it motivates you to learn to dance so you can have fun too. You with me? All right. So I'm going to tell you about, I guess I'm not going to go to it, that's the last slide. But okay, so I'm going to tell you about this study that Albert Bandura did. Bandura did a study back in the 60s called the Bobo doll study. And this was a time when we were first starting to concern ourselves with do children learn from watching violence on television? Now, a Bobo doll is one of those blow-up clowns that has sand in the bottom, and the kids punch it, and it comes right back up, right? You with me? So what Bandura did is he took a bunch of children, and he randomly assigned them into a control in an experimental group. And in the experimental group, the kids went into a room and watched a video of an adult with the Bobo doll. And the adult proceeded to beat the hell out of the Bobo doll, okay? Now, in the control group, the kids went in and saw the same adult in the playroom with the Bobo doll, but this time the adult did not beat up the Bobo doll, okay? So what happened then for the dependent variable is that all the children got to go into a playroom individually, and it was the same playroom, and there was the Bobo doll, okay? And so what they found was that the kids who saw the adult beat up the Bobo doll were much more likely to themselves beat up the Bobo doll, which is an example of which of these? Observational learning. They saw the adult do it, so they did it. Now, some of the kids who saw the adult do it did not beat up the Bobo doll when they went into the playroom, okay? But all of those children that had seen the adult but didn't do it themselves, right? When asked, can you show me what the adult did to the Bobo doll? All of those kids could show them. That's an example of what? Latent learning. Meaning that they learned it. They just weren't motivated to beat the doll up when they got into the room. So I'm going to show you a short video on the Bobo doll study, and it's pretty amazing what you can see about children and aggression and so forth. So let me get this. All of these videos, as usual, are available to you. So we go to modules. Bandura's Bobo doll study.
Early experiment on learning of aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. Children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a inflated doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. The letter measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than live ones. The model pummeled a doll with a mallet, flung it in the air.
I'm gonna tell you about this. So notice the things that she's doing. She hit it with a mallet, which is like a hammer. She threw it in the air, she kicked it, she punches it. Okay? So she's gonna get on top of it and beat it. This is what all the children in the experimental group watched. They saw this. Now here come the kids. Now notice he's doing some of the same things. He punches it, he throws it up in the air. Okay, still, now he picks up that hammer, the same thing she did, and bangs him, the Bobo doll, with the hammer. And look at that face, man. He looks like he's going for it. It gets worse, people. He's really going at it.
He's so angry.
Yeah, he looks angry. Okay, so now check this out. He gets a gun.
What?
Now, I want you to notice, remember that the lady, the model didn't have a gun. So now he's talking smack to it, and he's got this gun in his face, both of which were not modeled by the adult. So what Ventura found was that the children who had seen the aggression not only copied the aggression, in other words, the adult served as a model for them, but also escalated the aggression, and the children who saw the aggression were also much more likely to reach for the gun. So she takes a break and plays with the stove for a minute, but you're going to see that they use all of these things as weapons. So she's got the hammer, and she's gonna use the gun as well. And then you're going to see that she uses other things, other objects are used. So she makes up novel uses of other objects to be aggressive. So there's a ball. So far we've seen a gun, and we've seen a ball, and now we see the swinging ball. That's three things that we hadn't seen before. Not to mention the yelling. There she goes with the gun.
Who's child?
But all children, that's just it, is that this was what we found over and over again. Here's the fourth object that's being used. It's a doll. So she's using all kinds of stuff. She's beating it, she got on it, she's kicking it. And she's
It's a poor clown.
using that ball again.
Who she hits herself with?
Okay, so, wow, right? Okay. All right, so I want to remind you that you are now ready to do all of the learning quizzes. There are 2 quizzes on memory, but today I will assign all the other ones. We will go on to discuss memory next time, okay? Have a good one.